I was invited to speak about American trade policy and politics. And normally, I would start this kind of presentation by apologizing for the complexity of the US political system. But then I'm in Switzerland. And in my years of visiting Switzerland, no one has ever been able to explain to me how your political system works. So we're in good shape here. I'm going to talk about American trade policy and politics, and in particular, the new Obama administration's trade policy. But the reason I can keep this to under 20 minutes is because they don't actually have a trade policy yet. They're getting there. And part of this, and I think the ambassador talked about the lead-up time, we are still in a version of our transition. The new administration is in place, and yet it is not in place, and there are hundreds of positions that have yet to be filled. In contrast to a lot of very negative trade rhetoric in the campaign on the Democratic side of the aisle, including from now Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and President Obama and now Vice President Biden, if we look around the administration at the people who have been put in place in cabinet level positions, senior economic positions, they really are not protectionist. Ron Kirk, my successor, was the mayor of Dallas, and he saw how successful NAFTA could be on the ground in the state of Texas, in a border state. If you look at Hugh Locke, the new Secretary of Commerce, he's from the state of Washington. This is the state of Boeing, this is the state of Microsoft, this is the state of a lot of very trade competitive, open trade, including the Democratic representatives from that state, open trade state. We have Larry Summers in the White House, and so on and so forth. And when you look across the team, the senior level of the team, and you see the potential is there for as multinational, multilateral a trade policy as we saw in the previous administration, or indeed in every administration since the 1950s in the United States. And I would note that between 1934 and the 1950s in the United States, it was the Democratic Party that was the party of free trade, and it was the Republican Party that was the party of protectionism. It's one thing to be reactive at home, and we see the first initial signs that the trade policy on the table is indeed reactive. It is not yet proactive. But those initial signs were not such to give one great faith. There was in the stimulus package, as you all know, I suspect you know, Buy American language, language having to do with visas, language in subsequent legislation having to do with trucking between the United States and Mexico, where the Congress abrogated, violated the agreement, the NAFTA agreement, when it comes to cross-border trucking. And in each one of those cases, the administration had to step forward, reluctantly, but had to step forward and take a stand to try to moderate or modify or water down the negative trade impact of these congressional provisions. One of the great benefits of the WTO, of the World Trade Organization and the GATT and the agreements under that trading system is it has created a very real floor for protectionism in the world. And one of the purposes of the Doha Round, obviously, is to raise that floor to an even higher standard. But this administration recognizes that from a US business perspective, 95% of the world's consumers are outside our borders. And if you look at potential trends in global economic growth even before the current economic crisis. Well over half of global economic growth, of GDP growth in the world, would take place in advanced developing countries, not in the developed world. And US trade policy, this administration will come to realize, needs to reflect that. During the course of the Bush administration, the United States started out with free trade agreements with 3 countries, and by the end had concluded free trade agreements with 20 countries. Of the 17 free trade agreements negotiated during the course of the Bush administration, 3 of them were never enacted into law. Free trade agreements with Colombia, with Panama, and with South Korea. What will this administration do with those free trade agreements involving 100 million consumers of US products? And in most cases, given the fact that, as you all know, US trade barriers are very low to begin with, those 3 free trade agreements represent primarily the opening of foreign markets, those 3 country markets, to US exports. In the case of the Bush administration, Doha Round, as most of you know, was launched in 2001. It is very, very hard to stay excited about a trade negotiation that's been going on for 8 years. And for business people, it's very hard to get excited about a trade agreement that will take at least 10 years to implement, if and when it is finally agreed. However, this is an incredibly important agreement. As Federal Councilor Leutard talked about last night, it has psychological implications in terms of economic stimulus, but above all, if we are to meet the promise of the Doha Round, which is the promise of a, quote, development agenda, we could and should see a transformation of the roles and responsibilities of the advanced developing countries in global economic trade. One of the interesting questions in terms of moving ahead with the commitments made, pledges yesterday from the G20, and other such commentaries, is that many think that the way out of this is for the United States to go back to the overconsumption and undersaving that helped to contribute to this problem in the first place. There is a problem with that scenario. And the new administration recognizes there is a problem with that scenario. And their trade policy, and here I'm talking about trade policy in the broadest sense, monetary policy as well. Their trade policy will reflect that economic dilemma, that dilemma as to how one moves forward when the rest of the world would really like the United States to be the engine of growth, sucking in everybody else's exports. How the administration addresses these global imbalances, well, we'll see.